A billionaire disguised herself as a poor cleaner to test her in-laws. But when they kicked her, mocked her, and tried to destroy her, she froze. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled, because what they didn't know was that she owned everything they were standing on, and what happened next will shock you. It began with the sharp sting of bleach on her hands and the cold marble floor beneath her knees. Isabella's rag swept back and forth, scrubbing furiously, while the echo of laughter drifted down the grand staircase. Martha Whitmore, her mother-in-law, leaned against the railing in her silk robe, sipping from a crystal glass. "Faster, girl," she sneered, her eyes glittering with cruelty. "If you can't even clean properly, what use are you?" Isabella pressed her lips together, refusing to answer. Silence was her shield. Silence kept her cover intact. To Martha, she was nothing but a poor cleaner who had married her mad son. But behind Isabella's lowered lashes, memories flickered, champagne toasts at her own company's launches, headlines calling her the youngest female billionaire to conquer real estate. Those days felt like another life, buried beneath betrayal. She had chosen this disguise, this degradation, for one reason, to test who loved her when there was nothing to gain. A sudden kick caught her in the stomach, forcing her to gasp and steady herself on the bucket. Martha's voice sliced through the air. "Pathetic. My son deserves better than you. You'll ruin him." Isabella curled inward from the pain, but in her mind another memory bloomed, a night when her ex-husband, drunk with power, had raised his fist at her after she questioned his affair with the housemaid. That betrayal had been the final straw. She had sworn never again to be fooled by a man's sweet words or greedy hands. If she was to be loved, it would be for herself, not her fortune. From the corner of the room, David sat slumped in a chair, his eyes vacant, a sketchbook in his lap. People called him mad, unfit, a burden. But Isabella had seen the truth flicker behind those clouded eyes. Sometimes he would draw with startling clarity, a house, a pair of twins holding hands, a woman smiling in sunlight. She often caught her breath at those sketches, as if he was drawing glimpses of a future he didn't yet understand. "Look at him," Martha barked, pointing to her son. "A fool paired with a beggar. What a curse." Richard Whitmore, David's father, muttered in agreement, his voice heavy with drink. "She'll drain us dry. You mark my words." Isabella rose slowly, her rag dripping water onto the pristine floor. For a moment, she almost spoke, almost shattered the illusion with the truth of her billions. But then David's eyes lifted from his sketchbook and found hers. There was something there, a flicker of trust, of need, that made her swallow the words. Instead, she bent her head and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "I'll never leave you, David. Not like they want me to." His hand tightened around the pencil, and though he said nothing, a single tear slid down his cheek. Martha scoffed, turning away in disgust. But Isabella knew, every cruelty she endured was a seed. And one day, the harvest would come. The storm broke not outside, but inside the Whitmore mansion. Richard's voice boomed through the dining hall, rattling the crystal glasses. "Enough." He slammed his fist against the table, making David flinch. "You and that worthless cleaner will not eat another meal under my roof. Get out." David blinked rapidly, confused, his fork trembling in his hand. "But, Father, I didn't." His words stumbled over each other, his voice childlike, lost. Martha's lips curled in triumph. "Do you hear that?" she hissed, circling Isabella like a predator. "The madman can barely form a sentence, and you," she jabbed her finger into Isabella's shoulder, "you think marrying him makes you more than a parasite?" Isabella's spine stiffened, though her heart pounded in her chest. She reached for David's hand under the table, gripping it firmly, grounding him as his eyes darted around in panic. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice steady even as her stomach twisted. "We'll go." Richard sneered, tossing an envelope onto the floor. The paper scattered, revealing a handful of coins and a bus ticket. Here's your fortune, cleaner. Take him and beg in the streets. That's all you're good for." David bent to pick up the envelope, his fingers shaking, but Isabella caught his hand midair. "No," she said sharply, her eyes blazing into Richard's. "Keep your scraps." For a fleeting second, her old self, the billionaire who once stood before senators and CEOs, shone through. Richard faltered, taken aback by the fire in her gaze, before laughing cruelly. "You'll come crawling back." They didn't. That night, Isabella led David through the darkened streets, his arm looped tightly around hers. He muttered disjointed words, fragments of old conversations with ghosts only he could see. Passers-by stared, some pitying, others smirking. A woman in a ragged coat shook her head as Isabella guided him onto a bus. "That poor girl," the woman muttered to a stranger. "Married a madman. What future can she have?" Isabella's jaw tightened, but she didn't reply. She had chosen this path. She had chosen obscurity, humiliation, and pain. Because love tested in fire was the only love worth keeping. As the bus rumbled on, David leaned his head against the glass, humming softly. The sound reminded Isabella of her mother's lullabies, her mother who had died when Isabella was just 15, leaving her to inherit both fortune and enemies. She saw flashes of the boardroom battles she'd fought, the betrayals by men who had sworn to love her but only lusted after her bank accounts. One had tried to drain her assets into his own shell companies. Another had raised his hand when she refused to sign away her properties. Each scar had pushed her deeper into suspicion, until disguise became her salvation. Now, as David hummed, she stroked his knuckles gently, whispering, "They'll regret this. Every insult, every kick, every coin tossed at our feet, one day, they'll kneel." David's humming stopped. He looked at her, eyes clearer than before, and for a heartbeat his voice was steady. "You'll make them pay." The bus jolted over a bump, snapping the fragile clarity away. He blinked, confused again. But Isabella's lips curved into the faintest, most dangerous smile. "Yes, David. I'll make them pay." The city's night was cruel to the unprotected. The air reeked of smoke and wet pavement as Isabella guided David down a dim alley, her arm firm around his waist. They had nowhere to go. Every inn she approached had slammed its doors shut at the sight of his vacant stare and her cleaner's rags. By dawn, they huddled beneath the awning of a closed bakery, David mumbling nonsense, rocking gently. Isabella pulled her thin sweater tighter around them both, shielding him from the morning chill. When the shopkeeper arrived at sunrise, he sneered at them. "Filthy beggars. Off my doorstep." He tossed a bucket of water, the icy splash soaking Isabella to the skin. David shrieked at the sudden cold, thrashing like a frightened child. Isabella cradled his face. "It's all right, David. Look at me. Only me." Slowly, he calmed, staring into her eyes as if she was the only anchor left in his world. That day, Isabella made her choice. Swallowing her pride, she walked to the busy street corner and knelt, holding out her hands to strangers rushing past. "Please, anything you can spare," she whispered. Her voice trembled at first, but necessity hardened it. A businessman dropped a few coins without looking. A teenage boy mocked David, tossing bread at his feet. Isabella held David close, forcing herself not to lash out. Every humiliation was another stone in the wall of her revenge. Hours later, she guided David into a church, their clothes still damp. She knew this place. It was the Whitmore's church. Martha and Richard had sat in those very pews, preaching generosity while spitting venom at their own blood. The irony cut deep. Isabella knelt at the altar, clutching David's hand. "Father, forgive us. We need help." Her voice cracked with sincerity, though inside her heart whispered a vow, "I will rise from this floor and they will bow at my feet." As the congregation filed in, whispers spread. "Isn't that Richard's son? Who's that woman with him? She looks like a beggar. Isabella kept her eyes down, but her ears burned with every word. One woman leaned over to her husband and whispered just loud enough, "What a disgrace. To think the Whitmores produced such shame." David's fingers tightened around hers. His voice trembled. "They're laughing." She turned to him, brushing his cheek. "Then don't listen. Listen only to me. One day, they won't laugh. They'll weep." That night, Isabella took him to a rundown psychiatric hospital, a place few wanted to be seen near. The doctor eyed David skeptically. "Treatment will be long, and costly." "Are you sure?" "I'll find the money," Isabella said firmly, even as her stomach churned with hunger. When she walked back into the street, the moon above seemed almost mocking. But she smiled faintly, her hand resting against her belly, though she hadn't yet confirmed it. Somewhere deep inside, a stirring told her she wasn't only fighting for David anymore. Something new was growing, fragile and unstoppable. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and despair. Isabella sat with her hands clenched, her heart drumming louder than the ticking clock on the wall. The doctor returned, his face unreadable as he held out the thin paper in his hand. "Congratulations," he said simply. "You're pregnant. With twins." For a moment, the words didn't land. Pregnant. Twins. Her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. She pressed her palm against her stomach, as if she could already feel the flutter of life there. In the corner, David sat humming softly, his eyes darting between the ceiling tiles. She reached for him, whispering, "David, you're going to be a father." He tilted his head, frowning as if trying to piece together the words. "Father," he echoed. His hand trembled as he touched her stomach, then pulled back in fear. They'll take them. Mother will take them." His eyes widened with panic. Isabella cupped his face, forcing him to look at her. "No, David. No one will take them. Not Martha, not Richard. They'll never touch our children." Her voice broke with steel she didn't know she had. "These babies will grow up knowing love. And when the world sees them, the Whitmores will choke on their shame." For weeks, she scraped by on the streets, stretching every coin between food for herself and treatments for David. At night, she'd rest her head on his shoulder while he stared at the stars, sketching on scraps of paper she scrounged from bins. Sometimes his sketches startled her, two identical little girls holding hands, their hair in ribbons. She traced the drawings with her fingers, her chest tightening. How can he see them before they exist? One evening, as she prepared stale bread for them both, David suddenly looked at her with clarity that cut through his fog. "Isabella," he said slowly, as though pulling the name from deep within, don't let them hurt you again." His eyes glistened. "Not like they did." Her hand froze mid-air. He remembered. "Not everything, but enough." That night, she lay awake beside him on the cold floor, replaying the doctor's words, the feel of David's clarity, the sound of Martha's cruel laughter. In her heart, she began to weave the threads of her revenge. She would raise these twins to be proof of survival, of love, of a power greater than wealth alone. And when the Whitmores saw what she had built, their arrogance would crumble. But life was merciless. Hunger gnawed at her bones, and whispers in the church grew louder. "Why bring children into this misery?" a woman sneered one Sunday, handing her a coin like she was tossing bread to a stray dog. Isabella's hand shook as she accepted it, her other hand clutching her belly protectively. She whispered into the silence of the night as David slept beside her, "Hold on, my little ones. One day, your cries will shake the very halls that mocked us." The cries of newborns split the night like a holy fire. In the dim ward of the city hospital, Isabella's hands trembled as two tiny girls were placed against her chest, their fragile bodies wrapped in thin cloth. Tears streamed down her face, mixing joy with exhaustion. She kissed their foreheads, whispering, "You are my strength, my justice." The nurse glanced skeptically at the man sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth. "Is he safe to be here?" she asked. Isabella looked at David, his eyes wide, his lips trembling as he stared at the twins. For the first time, his rocking slowed, his gaze sharpening. "Mine?" he whispered. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "Yours, David. Yours and mine." He staggered forward, clumsy but intent, and touched one of the baby's tiny hands. The little fist curled around his finger, and David gasped as if shocked by a spark. He sank to his knees beside the bed, pressing his forehead to Isabella's arm. They make the voices quiet," he murmured. In that moment, Isabella saw it. His madness was not permanent. There was a man buried inside, a husband, a father who could rise again. She would drag him back from the abyss if it killed her. Weeks bled into months. Isabella sold her own jewelry, the few hidden trinkets she'd smuggled out of her past life, to pay for treatments. At the psychiatric hospital, David endured endless therapy, his hands shaking as doctors guided him through memories that haunted his mind. Some days he lashed out, screaming, his voice echoing down sterile hallways. Other days he sat silent, tears rolling down his cheeks as he repeated his mother's cruel words, "Madman. Worthless. Madman." Isabella held him after every session. "You are not worthless," she whispered into his ear, rocking him as if he were one of their daughters. "You are my husband. You are their father. And one day, you will be whole." Their daughters grew quickly, their laughter echoing in the small rented room Isabella managed to secure near the hospital. She scrubbed floors for strangers, begged when she had to, and stitched old rags into dresses for the girls. Yet every smile from them was fuel for her fire. At night, she tucked them in and whispered, "You are not poor. You are not broken. You are Whitmore's by blood, but you will be my victory." One evening, after another grueling therapy session, David sat across from Isabella, his eyes clearer than they had ever been. "They kicked us out like dogs," he said slowly, deliberately. His jaw tightened. "They hurt you." His fists clenched. "I remember, Isabella." Her heart skipped. The clarity in his voice was no longer fleeting. It was anchoring. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Yes, David. They hurt us. But we'll make them remember too." His lips curled into something dangerous, something new, a smile of recognition, of fury. "Good," he whispered. "Then let's make them pay." The light above flickered, as if the city itself shuddered at the promise. The day David walked out of the psychiatric hospital, the air seemed brighter, thinner, as though even the city itself sensed a resurrection. He wore a plain shirt and trousers Isabella had patched and pressed, but on his face was something she hadn't seen in years, clarity. His step was unsure, but it was his own, not guided by nurses or ropes of restraint. Isabella walked beside him, their daughters holding her hands, skipping with childish delight. At the corner of the street, the girls darted toward a fruit stand. Isabella reached for them but paused, letting them taste their father's freedom with him. One of the twins, Clara, stumbled, bumping into David as he reached for her. His wallet slipped from his pocket, falling to the cobblestones. "Sir, your wallet," Clara said, her small hand picking it up carefully. She handed it back, her eyes bright with innocence. David froze, staring at her face. The slope of her nose, the shape of her mouth, it was his reflection in miniature. He looked at both girls, his breath catching in his throat. "They look like me," he whispered, his voice trembling between wonder and terror. Isabella's heart pounded. She knelt beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "They are you, David. They are us." The girls giggled, tugging at his sleeve, oblivious to the storm swirling in his chest. He sank onto a nearby bench, his hands shaking as he gathered them both into his arms. Their laughter filled the air, and for the first time, he embraced them fully, without fear. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he pressed kisses into their hair. I thought I'd never be more than what they called me. But look at me. Look at us. Isabella's throat tightened, her hand pressed over her chest. This was the moment she had prayed for through hunger, humiliation, and endless nights on cold floors. David was returning, not just to her, but to himself. They walked home together, the twins skipping ahead. Isabella's secret. The truth of her wealth, her empire waiting in silence, burned at the back of her throat. She had hidden it for so long, convinced love could only be proven in poverty. But now, watching David's strength returning, she began to wonder if the time was nearing to shatter the disguise. That night, after the girls slept, David sat across from her in their small room. The flicker of a candle cast shadows across his face, shadows that made him look both young and ancient. Isabella, he said quietly, why do they hate you so much? My family. I remember pieces. Mother kicking you, father turning away. His voice cracked. But why? Why did they treat you like dirt? Isabella held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. For years, she had swallowed the truth. But tonight, staring into his recovering eyes, she felt the first crack in her silence. Because, she whispered, her voice steady as steel, they thought I was nothing. They thought I was a cleaner who deserved to be crushed. She leaned closer, her eyes glinting. But one day, David, they'll see exactly who I am. And when they do, they will kneel. He nodded slowly, fire sparking behind his recovering gaze. Then I'll kneel with them. To you. The candle sputtered, throwing sparks against the wall, as if foreshadowing the blaze of revenge waiting to consume the Whitmores. The old city loomed before Isabella like a chessboard. For months she had walked its cracked pavements as a beggar, her hair tied back, her hands raw from scrubbing floors in houses where women whispered, poor thing, carrying twins with that madman of hers. But now, with David slowly recovering and her daughters growing stronger, the mask of weakness was beginning to itch. She returned home one evening with bread tucked under her shawl and found David sketching again. His lines were clearer now, buildings, faces, even the outline of the twins holding hands. He looked up at her, his voice steadier. They think we're nothing, he said, the words slow but deliberate. But, you're not nothing. I can feel it. You're hiding something. Her breath caught. She sat beside him, watching his hand trace the lines of a grand estate he didn't recognize. The Whitmore mansion. He was remembering without knowing. All in time, David, she whispered. For now, let them keep thinking we're nothing. When the truth comes, it will burn them. The next morning, Isabella returned to the church where Martha and Richard were respected patrons. She walked down the aisle carrying her twins, her head bowed as though still a beggar. Martha sat in the front pew, her jewels glittering as she gossiped loudly about her ruined son and his fool of a wife. Isabella knelt before the altar, ignoring the stares, but inside her mind, fire was building. Every cruel coin they had tossed her way, every insult hurled while she carried their bloodline in her womb, she was filing it all away. That night, she opened a wooden box hidden under their bed, revealing documents, land deeds, company shares, accounts that still bore her name. She had left her empire dormant, masked behind shell companies and trusted lawyers, but the power waited like a coiled snake. She stared at the papers, her hands trembling, then whispered, soon. David noticed the box. What's that? He asked softly. Our future, she said, closing it. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with the thrill of the storm she was preparing. And their destruction. Foreshadowing hung in the air like smoke. One evening, Clara overheard Martha's voice in the marketplace, calling Isabella a gutter rat who trapped her son. The little girl tugged Isabella's dress and whispered, Mama, why does Grandma hate you? Isabella's heart cracked but her voice was steady, because she doesn't know who I am yet, my love. One day, she will. The rage inside Isabella no longer felt like pain. It was becoming strategy. Every insult was a stone in the foundation of her revenge. Every sacrifice was fuel. And when the day came to unveil herself, Martha and Richard wouldn't just lose their pride, they would lose everything. David touched her hand that night, his eyes clearer than ever. "I'll stand with you," he said. Through it all. Isabella looked into the candle's flame, her jaw set. "Then stand strong. Because the time is coming when they will beg at our feet." The flame flickered, casting shadows that looked like gallows against the wall. The Sunday bells tolled, echoing across the marble pillars of St. Augustine's Cathedral, where the Whitmores always sat smugly in the front row, bathed in stained glass light like saints they would never be. Isabella walked in quietly, her twins clinging to her dress, David by her side, still healing but steadier with each step. Whispers rippled through the pews like wildfire, "The madman's wife. That beggar woman." Martha turned her head sharply, her lips curling when she saw them. "What gall," Martha hissed to a neighbor. "Dragging her filth into God's house." Isabella heard, but her face stayed serene. She guided her daughters forward and knelt near the altar, letting the whispers swirl around her like smoke. Then, as the collection plate was passed, she dropped in 2 gold coins, real ones, from her hidden reserves. They clinked loudly, the sound unnatural among the copper and crumpled notes of the poor. People turned. Even the priest hesitated, his eyes darting from the gleaming coins to Isabella's bowed head. Foreshadowing bloomed, Martha's face flushed with confusion. For a moment, her expression faltered. Where did a beggar get that kind of gold? After the service, Richard approached, his cane tapping against the floor. "What are you playing at, girl?" His voice was low but sharp. "You shame us by showing your face here. Take your bastard children and your lunatic husband and leave." David stiffened, his fists curling, but Isabella pressed a hand on his arm, her calm more dangerous than rage. She tilted her head, her voice soft yet cutting, "Careful, Richard. Sometimes the stones you throw break your own glass walls." The old man blinked, unsettled by her composure. Outside the cathedral, the crowd lingered, buzzing with curiosity. Isabella's daughters tugged at her skirt. "Mama, why did everyone stare?" Clara whispered. Isabella knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Because they don't know the truth yet. But one day, they will." That evening, Isabella visited a lawyer in secret, a man who had once managed part of her dormant estate. In the flickering lamplight of his office, she signed papers that began shifting assets quietly back into her name. Lands, properties, accounts. "Move everything into silence," she ordered. "No one must suspect until I say so." The lawyer looked uneasy. "If the Whitmores discover?" "They won't," she cut in, her eyes cold. "And when they do, it will be far too late." Back home, David sat watching the twins as they played on the floor. He lifted his gaze to Isabella. "You're planning something," he said slowly, as though pulling the thought out of fog. "Something big." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, David. They called you worthless. They called me dirt. But soon, they will choke on their own words." She blew out the candle, and in the darkness her voice lingered like a vow, "Revenge is coming." The day of reckoning arrived quietly, not with thunder, but with the rustle of papers and the metallic slam of doors. Martha and Richard Whitmore had called a family gathering at their estate, a grand lunch meant to parade their status before neighbors. Carriages lined the driveway, laughter spilled from the veranda, and servants carried trays of wine. They had invited the town's most prominent figures, unaware that the one woman they scorned most was walking through their gates armed with truth. Isabella entered dressed still as a cleaner, her shawl plain, her daughters holding her hands. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "She dares come here," one woman whispered. Martha's face hardened, her smile cracking. "You have no place here," she spat. "Leave before I have you thrown out." David stepped forward, his jaw set, his hand steady for once. "She has more right here than any of you," he said firmly, his voice ringing in a way it hadn't in years. Isabella's eyes glimmered, but she said nothing yet. Instead, she reached into her shawl and drew out a thick envelope. Calmly, she handed it to one of the men seated at the long table, a banker who had managed Whitmore accounts for decades. He opened it, expecting nonsense, but his eyes widened as he flipped through deeds and statements. The documents bore Isabella's name, not as a beggar or a servant, but as the sole owner of lands, estates, and companies worth more than the Whitmores could imagine. The banker stammered, "These holdings, they're in her name." He turned to Martha, confusion etching his face. "Did you know?" Martha lurched forward, snatching the papers. Her hands trembled as she scanned the seals, the signatures, the irrefutable proof. Her face drained of color. "Impossible," she hissed. Richard's cane clattered against the floor. "You tricked us," he growled, but the words lacked weight. His guests were staring now, whispers spreading like wildfire, "She's the real power." All this time. Isabella finally lifted her head, her voice low and steady. "No. You tricked yourselves. You looked at me scrubbing your floors and thought I was nothing. You sold me your son like discarded trash, thinking I was desperate. But I was watching. Waiting. And building the day you would be exposed." The room fell silent except for the quickened breaths of the twins, who clutched her skirt tighter. David placed a hand on Isabella's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride and disbelief. Martha's fury cracked into desperation. She turned to the guests, forcing a brittle laugh. "She forged these. A beggar couldn't own." But before she could finish, another guest spoke. "I've seen her name in the registries. She owns half the shipping yards on the East Coast." Another added, "And the Whitmore accounts, they've been in decline for years." We all knew. The humiliation was complete. Martha swayed as though struck, her world unraveling in front of everyone she had tried to impress. Isabella stepped closer, her whisper sharp enough to cut, "You should have been kinder. You should have remembered that even dirt, when pressed long enough, turns to diamond." Her daughters looked up at her, and for the first time, they saw not just their mother, but the woman who commanded empires. The Whitmore's reign of cruelty was crumbling, and the first bricks had just been torn away. The Whitmore estate, once a fortress of pride, had turned into a cage of whispers and shame. The revelation of Isabella's wealth had gutted Martha and Richard, but Isabella wasn't finished. Humiliation was only the beginning, justice demanded more. Days after the luncheon, notices were delivered to the Whitmore's doorstep. Foreclosure papers. Legal summons. The very properties they had boasted of, the lands they sneered over, were being repossessed, because they had been using Isabella's dormant holdings as collateral for years without realizing who truly owned them. Every signature they once scribbled in arrogance now bound them to ruin. Martha stormed into the lawyer's office, her voice shrill. "This is theft. She's manipulating records." The lawyer barely looked at her. "Everything is legitimate. You should have read the contracts more carefully. She holds the controlling interest. You hold nothing." Word spread like wildfire. Once proud neighbors who had dined at the Whitmore's table now crossed the street to avoid them. The invitation stopped. Their staff resigned. Even the church pew that once bore their names sat empty, while Isabella and her family filled it with quiet dignity. But Isabella wasn't content with silent victory. One evening, she returned to the Whitmore estate, not in rags, but in her true form. Draped in silk, diamonds glinting at her throat, she walked through the cracked iron gates with David by her side, his steps firm, his madness gone like a shadow lifted. Their daughters trailed behind, wide-eyed witnesses to the fall of arrogance. Martha stumbled out, her once perfect hair undone, her face pale. She spat. You think this is over? You think you've won? Isabella's laugh was soft but dangerous. Oh, Martha. Winning was never the goal. Teaching you what it feels like, that was the goal. She stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. You kicked me while I scrubbed your floors. You spat on my children. You mocked the man you sold as if he were livestock. Tell me, how does it feel now to be the beggar? Richard staggered to the doorway, his cane trembling in his hand. You'll regret this, girl. No one humiliates the Whitmores. David's voice cut through the night, stronger than ever. The Whitmores humiliated themselves. You raised me to be your pawn, then discarded me when I broke. But he gestured to Isabella, pride burning in his eyes, she rebuilt me. She gave me back my mind, my dignity, and now she's giving me justice. Isabella turned, signaling to men who stood waiting, officials, guards, lawyers. Remove them. Gasps echoed as Martha and Richard were escorted from their estate, stripped of titles, land, and legacy. Their cries carried into the night, but no one came to help. For the town, it was poetic, the tyrants undone by the very woman they scorned. Later, in the quiet of their new home, a mansion Isabella had once hidden away, David sat by the fire, the twins curled in his lap. He looked at Isabella, awe in his eyes. You planned all this, he murmured. She touched his face gently. I planned survival. Revenge was just the reward. Outside, the bells of St. Augustine's rang again, but this time, they tolled not for the Whitmore's power, but for its burial. And in their place, Isabella and her family rose, not just as survivors, but as rulers of their own destiny.